Every alien kingdom across the stars rejected the princess because of her disability. Yet none of them understood that destiny had already chosen a very different protector for her, and it was not a proud alien warrior, but a single human from a forgotten world, and his arrival would change the fate of her people forever. The princess was born into the great house of a powerful alien empire, whose banner stretched across a dozen systems. Her people were known for strength and perfection, and their rulers were always celebrated as flawless beings of grace and power. But the day she was born, whispers began to spread because her legs were weak and twisted. She could not walk as others did. Her body was fragile, and she relied on a chair of floating crystal to move through the palace halls. Though her mind was sharp and her spirit deep, the council of nobles looked at her with hidden shame. Her father, the king, loved her deeply, yet even he could not silence the voices of doubt. At the royal gatherings, suitors from distant stars were brought before her. Noble houses sent their heirs to speak with her, but one by one they turned away, not because of her lack of wisdom, but because they saw her as broken in a galaxy that prized perfection above all else. She became known as the disabled princess, the one no warrior prince or noble captain would ever claim. The rejection cut her deeper than any blade. Each night in her chamber, she listened to the sounds of celebration in the court below, the music of victory, feasts, the laughter of warriors boasting of their triumphs, and she wondered if she would ever be seen as more than a burden. When she looked into the mirror, she saw not a princess, but a shadow of what her people expected her to be. Her council whispered of dangerous times. Enemy fleets moved beyond the borders. Her empire needed allies, yet no treaty could be sealed, for no royal heir would stand beside her. They said her weakness would become the weakness of the throne, and the thought crushed her heart. She wanted to scream that she was more than her broken body, but her words were drowned by the endless silence of rejection. On the day of the great conclave, alien rulers from many systems gathered in the throne hall to see her once more. Her father begged them to look beyond the surface, to see the mind of a future queen who had read more history than any scholar, who understood the strategies of war better than many generals. But when she entered the chamber on her floating chair, the air grew cold. Eyes slid away, lips curled into polite but cruel smiles, and within moments, the answer was clear again. No one wanted her. No alliance would be made with the disabled princess. That night, she sat alone in the palace garden, where silver leaves glowed beneath the twin moons. Her heart felt like stone pressed into her chest. She whispered to the stars, asking why she had been born into such a place where even her worth as a daughter seemed questioned. And though the night gave her no reply, the wind carried rumors of something unexpected. Whispers spoke of an envoy, not from the proud empires, not from the ancient powers, but from a small world at the edge of the stars, a world called Earth. Humans, they were named, a species barely spoken of in the halls of the great houses. Some said they were weak. Others said they were unpredictable. No one cared much for their kind, for they lacked the brilliance of the elder races and the strength of the warrior clans. Yet the envoy had come with no army, no gifts of gold, no fleets of warships, only with words and a strange sense of honor. Princes heard the first murmur of his arrival when a guard entered the garden, his voice unsure as he announced that a human traveler had requested audience with her father. The king laughed at the idea. The council sneered. Some even mocked that the broken princess could finally have a suitor fit for her, since no one else wanted her. But deep within her chest she felt a spark of something different. Not hope exactly, but curiosity, because unlike the others, this human had not come to judge her worth against perfection. He had come because he believed her people deserved to be seen. The guard asked if she wished to see him, and though her heart beat fast and her hands trembled, she said yes, she wanted to see this human, not because she thought he would change anything, but because he was the first in all the galaxy who had asked nothing of her title, nothing of her throne, and nothing of her body. He had only asked for a chance to speak. That night, as the council debated in anger over the insult of receiving a human, the princess prepared herself. She wrapped a cloak around her fragile body. She fixed her crown upon her hair, and she told herself that even if this was another rejection, she would face it with her head held high, because no matter what they thought, she was still a daughter of the throne, and her spirit would not bow. When she entered the hall, the air was heavy with disdain. The council whispered their insults. The nobles rolled their eyes. Yet in the center of the chamber stood a man different from all others. His form was plain compared to the tall, glowing aliens, his clothes simple, his weapon no more than steel at his side. But his eyes lifted to meet hers, and in them she saw no mockery, no pity, and no fear, only recognition, as if he had been searching for her all along in that moment. Her world shifted, though she did not yet know why, and though she could not yet see how fate would unfold. Something inside her whispered that the tides of rejection were about to break, because this human was not like the others, and he had come not to take advantage of her weakness, but to fight for her worth, and the galaxy would never be the same. The hall was filled with silence as the human stood before the throne. His clothes were simple, his boots worn from long travel, his face calm, though he was surrounded by the towering figures of alien lords and noble guards, who looked down on him as if he were nothing more than dust in the wind. The princess sat upon her crystal chair at her father's side, her heart heavy from another day of rejection, but her eyes were fixed on this new figure who seemed so out of place in the glittering chamber. Council had already judged him before he spoke. Their voices were harsh, filled with disdain, as they questioned why a man from a forgotten world had been allowed to step into the sacred hall. They said the Empire needed strong allies, fleets with endless ships and armies bred for war. They said the human was a fool with no legacy and no power, but the king had granted him audience for curiosity's sake, and now every eye waited for the human to speak. He bowed low before the throne, not with the arrogance of noble heirs, nor with the cold pride of alien princes, but with a respect that came from the heart. His voice, when it rose, was steady and strong. He did not speak of wealth or fleets. He did not offer gifts or bribes. Instead, he said he had come to stand for a people who had been left alone. He spoke of loyalty, of trust, of the courage to fight, not for conquest, but for the lives of those who believed in hope. He said his world had little compared to the great empires, but what they did have was the will to stand and never bow. The council laughed their cruel laughter, echoing against the golden walls. They mocked him, calling humans weak, creatures of flesh and bone with short lives and little worth. One noble stepped forward, his armor shining with the glow of his house, and he sneered at the human, asking what made him believe he could ever stand among them, what made him think he was worthy of alliance with the royal throne. The princess listened with her breath caught between anger and sorrow, for every other envoy who had stood before her had measured her value against her broken body, but this man was measured instead by the power he carried in his heart. And though the nobles mocked him, he did not lower his gaze nor step back from their scorn. He stood calm, his eyes steady, as if their insults meant nothing to him. When the noble finished his mocking challenge, the human finally spoke, his words slow and sharp, like blades through the air. He said that worth was not measured by perfect bodies or shining fleets, but by the courage to protect, and the loyalty to stand even when all others turn away. His words were plain, simple, and without grandeur, yet they carried a weight that silenced the hall for a breath. Noble warrior could not bear such defiance from a man he saw as nothing. He stepped closer, his hand upon the hilt of his blade, and in a voice loud enough for all to hear, he challenged the human to combat. He said, if humans believed in loyalty and courage, let him prove it with steel before the throne, and if he lost, then his people would forever be counted among the weak. Gasps filled the chamber. Some called for the duel to be stopped, for it was dishonor to draw blood in the royal hall, but others whispered with cruel delight, eager to see the human cut down for their amusement. The king looked uneasy, yet he could not deny the rules of challenge, for in their traditions, a duel of honor once spoken could not be refused. The princess's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to cry out to stop it, for this man was the first to look at her without pity, the first to stand in her presence without turning away. She did not want his life wasted for the pride of arrogant nobles, but when she looked at him, she saw no fear in his eyes, only calm resolve as he stepped forward and accepted the duel. His voice, quiet but unshaking, the hall was cleared. The crowd pressed close to watch the human and the noble face one another. The alien warrior was tall, his armor glowing with power, his blade forged from crystal steel, his body bred for battle. Every movement of his stance spoke of years of training and victories. The human, by contrast, wore no armor. His blade was plain and old, yet in his hands it seemed alive, as if it carried the weight of something greater than metal. The duel began with the noble charging forward, his strikes heavy, his speed fueled by rage. Sparks flew as steel met crystal. The human was driven back again and again, yet he did not fall. Instead, he moved with sharp precision. His steps small, his eyes focused. He did not try to match strength. For strength, he waited, measured, and countered. His blade finding the gaps where pride had left the noble open. The crowd roared, some in anger, others in surprise. As the fight dragged on longer than any had expected, sweat poured from the noble's brow, his strikes growing wilder, his arrogance slipping away, while the human, though cut and bruised, still stood firm, his breathing steady, his will unbroken. Princess gripped the edge of her chair, her nails digging into the crystal as her heart pounded with fear and hope. She had never seen anyone fight like this, not with brute power, but with quiet endurance. Every strike, every block, every movement told her he fought not for his own pride, but for something deeper, perhaps for the promise he had spoken of loyalty and honor. At last the noble lunged with all his strength, his blade flashing toward the human's heart. But in that instant the human stepped aside with calm precision, his sword rising in a single stroke that disarmed his opponent, sending the crystal blade clattering across the floor. The noble fell to his knees. Stunned silence filled the chamber as the human stood over him, weapon lowered. Not striking the final blow, but instead offering the chance to yield. Gasps turned to murmurs. The council shifted uneasily. Never before had a human stood against one of their warriors and triumphed. The noble bowed his head in shame, forced by honor to admit defeat. The human did not smile nor boast. He simply stepped back, his sword lowered, his eyes lifting once more to meet those of the princess. In that look she felt something stir within her. For the first time she saw not rejection, but recognition. He had fought, not to humiliate nor to claim glory, but to show that worth came from will, not from the body. And in that moment, she knew this man was different from every other who had turned away. Yet, beyond the walls of the palace, danger loomed. Shadows gathered across the stars. The Empire's enemies had seen the weakness of a throne without allies, and they prepared to strike. And though none in the hall yet knew it, the duel of the human was only the first step in a storm that would decide the fate of the princess, her people, and perhaps the galaxy itself. The chamber still trembled with the weight of the duel as the human stood silent, his sword lowered, his chest rising and falling with steady breath, while the alien noble sat in shame, his weapon cast aside. The council whispered in disbelief. Their perfect order had been shaken by a man they considered weak and unworthy, and though no one spoke it aloud, they all felt the truth. The human had proven something none of them wished to admit. King watched in silence, torn between pride and fear, for while the human had shown courage, it also revealed the danger of relying on outsiders. The council began to speak, their voices sharp and bitter. They argued that the duel meant nothing, that the Empire still needed true allies with fleets and armies. They said humans could never stand against the empires of the stars. They dismissed the victory as chance, yet their words rang hollow, for all had seen how the human had fought with skill and resolve that no arrogance could deny. The princess sat beside her father, her hands trembling upon the arms of her crystal chair, her heart still racing. She had seen warriors all her life, but never like this, never one who fought with such quiet strength, not for glory, not for pride, but for honor and for her. For though he had not spoken her name, she felt in her soul that he had stood that day, so she would not be mocked again. She longed to speak, To him yet the weight of the council's scorn pressed heavy upon her, and the hall was thick with unspoken tension. That night as the stars burned cold outside the palace walls, the princess sat alone in her chamber. Her mind filled with images of the duel, she whispered into the night, asking why this human who owed her people nothing had risked his life before the throne when others with power and armies had turned away. She thought of his eyes, steady, calm, and unbroken, and for the first time in her life, she wondered if perhaps her worth was not bound to her broken body, but to the choices she could still make far across the stars. Another story was unfolding. Fleets of an enemy empire stirred in the void. They had watched the kingdom weaken. They had seen the endless rejections of the princess. They knew no noble would stand with her. They smelled blood in the water, and they prepared their armies to strike. The empire of the disabled princess would be easy prey, or so they believed, for weakness invites conquest, and predators always hunt where they sense fear. Rumors reach the palace through broken transmissions and trembling scouts, whispers of enemy warships massing at the border. The council met in secret chambers, their fear hidden behind walls of pride. Some said they must surrender territory to buy peace. Others said they must abandon the princess and seek another heir. One even dared to say that perhaps her life was the very chain dragging the empire into ruin. Their words cut like knives, but they spoke them with cold calculation for survival. The human heard these whispers, though none wished him to know, and he went to the princess when the halls were quiet. He asked to see her, not as envoy, not as warrior, but as man to woman. When she allowed him into her chamber, he bowed his head, not to mock her, but to honor her, and when their eyes met, he spoke simply. He told her he had seen councils like this before in other places, on other worlds, always filled with men who called themselves wise, yet hid their fear behind fine words. He told her that fear could not defend a people, that only courage could, and that courage was born not from perfect strength, but from refusing to yield. Her throat tightened with emotion, for no one had ever spoken to her like this. Not even her father, who loved her, had told her she could lead, but this human who knew nothing of her world, who had no reason to stand by her, looked at her as if she was already a queen. She felt tears burn in her eyes as she asked him why he stayed, why he had not turned away like the others. He answered with words that burned into her heart. He said he stayed because where all others saw weakness, he saw someone still fighting, someone who had not given up, though the world had given up on her. And he said that loyalty meant nothing if it fled when times grew dark. The princess could not reply, her voice lost to the storm inside her chest, but she knew then that this man was not like the others, and perhaps he was the only one in all the stars who truly saw her as more than broken. The following day, the council met with grim faces. News had arrived. The enemy fleets were on the move. Their ships would soon cross the borders. Panic whispered through the nobles, who had spent so long chasing alliances that now none could be found. Their pleas had been rejected by all great houses, and they were left alone. They argued again, some demanding retreat, others demanding surrender, none willing to fight. But when the human rose to speak, they turned their scorn upon him again, telling him to leave, telling him his duel meant nothing, telling him his people were too weak to matter. But the princess this time did not sit silent. Her voice, though soft, cut through their noise. She said, no more retreat, no more shame. She said their enemies smelled fear because the council had shown nothing but fear. She said her empire would fight, and she would lead even if they called her broken. She would lead with the human at her side, and in her voice was a strength none had heard before. The council fell silent, unable to answer. For the first time the disabled princess had spoken as queen. The human stood beside her, and in that moment the hall seemed different, for though she could not walk, her spirit stood taller than any warrior. The king looked upon her with tears hidden in his eyes, for he saw in his daughter the leader he had prayed for. And though the council whispered still, they could not deny the truth. She was no longer silent, no longer the princess rejected, but the heir who would fight yet beyond the palace walls. The storm grew darker. The enemy fleets moved faster than expected, their weapons gleaming Their armies vast, they had no doubt of their victory, and they came to burn her world to ash. But the princes and the human would not yield. And together they prepared for the coming fire. The first battle was yet to come, and the galaxy itself held its breath. Skies above the princess's world grew dark as enemy fleets crossed the border, their warships like shadows that blotted out. The stars, each ship carried soldiers bred for battle and weapons. Powerful enough to tear cities apart, the people of the Empire trembled, for the Council had failed to bring allies, and the nobles whispered in fear. But in the palace hall the princess sat upon her crystal chair, her eyes steady, her voice firm, and beside her stood the human who had sworn he would not leave her. The council begged her to flee. They said she must hide while the army tried to hold the walls, but she shook her head and told them she would not hide. She told them if her people must fight, then she would fight with them, not with her body, but with her voice, her mind, and her will. The human looked at her with quiet pride, for he saw the courage burning inside her, and he knew it was stronger than any weapon. The human stepped forward and offered to train the royal guard, for though the Empire had soldiers, they lacked discipline and heart. Their nobles had led them with fear, not loyalty, and their spirits were broken. But the human said he had seen armies rise and fall, and he knew that strength did not come only from weapons, it came from the will to fight for something worth dying for. The council laughed, saying he was only one man, and what could one human teach? But the princes silenced them and gave him command of the training. From that day the palace grounds rang with the clash of steel and the sound of voices. The human drove the soldiers harder than they had ever been driven before, yet he also taught them what no noble had taught. He told them why they fought. He told them they fought not for the pride of houses nor for the arrogance of counselors, but for their families, for their homes, and for the princess, who refused to abandon them. He taught them to see her not as weak, but as the heart of the Empire, for though her body was fragile, her courage gave them strength. The princess watched the training from her chair, her eyes often filled with tears as she saw men and women who once looked at her with pity now bow their heads with respect. When they passed her, they no longer saw a broken air, they saw their queen, and each day her voice grew stronger as she spoke to them, encouraging them, reminding them that survival would not come from fear, but from unity. Enemy fleet drew closer, and soon the sound of thunder shook the skies as the first ships descended. Fire rained upon the outer lands, cities trembled, and smoke rose on the horizon. The council cried out in despair, saying it was hopeless, that they must surrender. But the human only tightened his grip upon his sword and told them to stand firm. He reminded them that every empire believed them broken and weak, and that was their greatest weapon. For the enemy expected no resistance, they expected fear, but instead they would face fire. The first clash came at the gates of the capital. The enemy soldiers marched in endless ranks, their armor glowing with power, their weapons burning through stone. The people screamed, and many were ready to run, yet the human stood before the gates, the royal guard at his back, and his voice cut through the fear like a blade. He shouted that no step backward would be taken, that today they would show the galaxy that loyalty was worth more than perfection, and his cry carried through the soldiers until their fear turned into fury. The battle raged. The human fought at the front, his blade striking with speed and precision. Though he was only flesh, he moved with a will that seemed unbreakable. He cut down foes larger and stronger, yet he never fell. The soldiers followed him there, lines holding where once they would have broken, and above it all the princess gave orders from the palace tower, her mind sharp, her strategy guiding every move. She sent signals to flank the enemy, to cut their supply lines, to trap them in the narrow streets. She fought with thought and voice, and together with the human, they turned chaos into defense. For hours the city shook with war. The enemy pressed harder and harder, believing victory close, yet each time they were thrown back, their arrogance failing them, for they had never faced soldiers who fought for love of their people and loyalty to a leader who had been rejected by all others. But the enemy was vast, and wave after wave crashed upon the defenders until even the strongest began To falter, the council once more cried for retreat, but the princess silenced them. With fire in her voice she told them, if they fled now the people would lose all hope, and she would rather die upon the throne than live as a queen who abandoned her crown. Her words struck their hearts like thunder, for even the human turned to look at her with awe, and the soldiers shouted her name with renewed fury, fighting harder than ever before. Night fell, and the city burned. The battle seemed endless. Yet still the human stood, blood upon his face, but fire in his eyes. He fought not for glory, but for the promise he had given. He fought because he had sworn never to leave her, and every strike of his blade was proof of his loyalty. The princess knew the morning would bring either survival or ruin, yet she felt something stronger than fear. She felt the bond between her and the human, and she knew that together they would face whatever came. Far beyond the smoke, the enemy leaders prepared for one final strike. They would throw all their strength at the capital at dawn, believing the walls would crumble and the defenders break. But in the palace hall, the princess and the human stood side by side. Their people gathered around them. The soldiers knelt and pledged themselves not to nobles, not to council, but to her, their queen, and to the man who had shown them what loyalty meant. The human placed his hand upon his sword and promised that when dawn came, he would stand at the gate again, and he would not fall. The princess looked at him, her eyes shining with tears and pride, and she whispered that no matter what happened, her people would remember him as the man who gave them hope. And as the stars faded and the night gave way to the first light of morning, the city held its breath. The enemy gathered their forces for the final assault. The defenders stood ready, and in the heart of it all, the disabled princess and the human stranger prepared for the last stand. The night was heavy with smoke and silence. The city burned in the distance, and the people waited with fear in their hearts for the enemy to strike at dawn. The princess sat upon her crystal chair in the palace hall, her eyes sharp, her body trembling, not with weakness but with the weight of what was to come. Beside her stood the human, his sword resting at his side, his face calm, though he knew that the morning would bring the fiercest battle yet. When the first light touched the horizon, the ground began to shake. The enemy moved forward with all their power. Their warships darkened the skies, their soldiers filled the fields like a tide of steel and fire. They came with a roar, believing this day would break the empire and end the reign of the disabled princess forever. But inside the capital, the defenders stood ready. The royal guard, who had once doubted themselves, now gripped their weapons with firm hands, their eyes fixed on the gate where the human had promised to stand. The princess rose from her chair, and though her legs could not carry her, she lifted her voice so that all could hear. She spoke of her people, of the home they must protect, of the children who slept in fear. She told them that their worth was not measured by what others thought, but by the courage they showed when hope seemed lost. Her words carried through the hall and into the streets, and the people cried out her name, no longer calling her weak, but calling her queen. The human stepped forward, his voice strong. He told them that the enemy believed them broken, but today they would prove that loyalty and love were stronger than fear. He raised his sword, and the guard raised theirs, and together they shouted as one, the sound rolling like thunder across the city walls. Then the enemy came crashing against the gates, their weapons pounding the stone, their soldiers pouring forward. The ground shook as if the earth itself would break. But the human stood at the front, his sword flashing in the rising light. He fought with everything he had, every strike of his blade cutting not only through steel, but through the fear of those who followed him. The guard fought at his side, their hearts burning with the courage he had given them. The princess gave orders from the palace tower, her voice carried through the signal horns. She directed the defenders to block the enemy's flanks. She ordered fire traps lit in the narrow streets. She commanded archers to rain arrows upon the invaders. Her mind sharp, her spirit unbroken. Though she could not wield a blade, she wielded her will like a weapon, and her people saw her as their guiding star. Battle was fierce. The enemy poured wave after wave into the city, their numbers endless, their strength Overwhelming, yet each time they pressed forward the defenders struck back. The human never fell, though blood covered his arms and his breath grew heavy. He stood like a wall, unshaken each time his body threatened to give way. He remembered his promise that he would not leave her, and he found strength again. Hours passed and the city was torn by fire and war. The council hid in silence, their voices gone, for they had no words left. The people, however, did not yield. They fought harder than any enemy expected, for they no longer believed themselves broken. They believed in their queen, and in the human who had chosen to stand with Herat. Last, the enemy gathered for one final push. Their greatest warlord stepped forward, his armor black, his weapon burning with power, his roar shaking the ground. He sought to end the fight by cutting down the human. Before all eyes the two met at the heart of the gate, steel against fire, flesh against brute strength. The clash rang through the city as the human faced an opponent far larger, far stronger. Yet he did not give way. He remembered every insult spoken in the throne hall, every noble who had called him unworthy, every whisper that the princess was broken, and he fought with the fury of every word. He had sworn to defy the duel rage. The warlord strikes heavy, enough to break stone, but the human moved with precision, his sword flashing with speed. Each time he fell back, he rose again until at last he found the single opening he needed. With a cry that echoed across the walls, he struck true, his blade piercing through the enemy's pride. The warlord fell, and with him the spirit of the invading army broke. The enemy soldiers faltered, their courage shattered. They fled into the smoke and fire. Their warships turned retreating into the sky. The city, though scarred, still stood, and the defenders, though weary, raised their voices in triumph. The people cried out the name of their queen, and they cried out for the human who had saved them. The disabled princess was no longer seen as a burden. She was their savior, their leader, their heart. When the battle ended and silence returned, the princess sat upon her crystal chair, her crown shining in the smoke-filled light. The human stood before her, his body marked with wounds, his sword heavy in his hand, yet his eyes still calm. She looked at him, tears shining, and asked the question that had burned in her heart since the day he arrived. Why had he stayed when all others had left? Why had he fought when he could have walked away? A hall grew quiet as he answered, his voice steady. He said he stayed because he saw her worth when others refused. He said he fought because loyalty is not about strength or perfection. It is about standing when no one else will. He said he stayed because she was not broken. She was the bravest soul he had ever known. The princess wept not with sorrow, but with pride. She reached out her hand, though it trembled, and he took it gently. Before the eyes of her people she declared him not a stranger, not an outsider, but the protector of the throne. The people cheered, and the legend of that day spread beyond the stars. In the years to come, stories were told of the human who saved the disabled princess, and the queen who rose from rejection to lead her people with courage and wisdom. Other empires who once mocked her now sent envoys in respect, but she never forgot that when all the galaxy turned away, only one human had stayed, and because of him her people survived. And so the tale was written not of perfection, not of strength born from pride, but of loyalty born from love and courage. It became a lesson whispered through the stars, that sometimes the weakest body holds the strongest heart, and that when every alien turned away, it was a human who stood and changed the fate of a queen forever. The end.